You're listening to the voice of Nassau Community College, 90.3 WHPC. My name is Bill McIntyre, and it's time for this week's Long Island News, the show that talks to newsmakers and other important people from Nassau and Suffolk County that matter to Long Island and Long Islanders like you. So each week we'll have a conversation about issues that affect all of us. I live on Long Island just like you, and I want to know more about where my tax dollars are going, and I want to know more about the people making the big decisions that affect all of us. Well, this week, we're welcoming back a friend of our show, Alfonso Castillo, the transit reporter for Newsday and Newsday.com, to update us on everything happening with the Long Island Railroad. Well, welcome back, Alfonso.
Thanks for having me on.
Oh, always a pleasure. Always a pleasure.
Same here.
So you've been reporting lately on the $700 million transformation of the LIRR's concourse at Penn Station. It's nearly complete. Well, I saw the video on Newsday.com showing off the new space. What can you tell us about Penn Station now for people who probably haven't been there since the pandemic or before the pandemic?
Yeah, that's the really interesting thing. I mean, this comes at a time when people have probably been away from Penn Station as long as they ever have. You know, if you were a regular commuter, you know, going through Penn Station for years or even decades, you have this idea of it being this cramped, rundown, dark, dingy place. And it's really gone through quite the transformation over the last couple of years. And I think it's been particularly dramatic the last couple of months. I mean, me going in, somewhat frequently, once a week or so, sometimes the difference from one week to the other was really remarkable. And it looks just about done. There are some things that are not quite done yet. The bathrooms still aren't open. The shops along the main concourse where the Long Island Railroad is still are not open. That's coming later this year. But again, those features or bugs of Penn Station that really gave it its bad reputation for so long, which was really how cramped it was, completely different now. The walkway there is about doubled in width. It's about 60 feet from where it was around 30 feet before. They accomplished this by pushing all the stores on the north side. Is that right? Yeah, the north side of the station back several feet. And they raised the ceiling quite a bit. And if you've been around there, even on street level over by 7th Avenue, you've seen all this work going on for years. The street closed down along 33rd Street there, and that's what they've been doing. They've been moving utilities, a lot of very literal heavy lifting to be able to raise the ceiling. But you go down there now, and it is brightly lit. There's lots of space. There are, again, seasoned commuters can remember everybody gathering over that one big departure board. The crowds have been dispersed because there are now these information displays throughout the whole station. So you don't get as much concentrating of crowds in any one place. It is really a dramatic change.
Yeah. It's funny because you just gave me visions in my head of, I always thought that was kind of quaint when everybody was sitting around that, and where the gates or the doors to the tracks were. It would, you say, I'm in the middle of New York City, and here's a bunch of people, and we're all looking at the same. It was like we were at a race, waiting for, waiting to see which horse came in. I had the experience of, and I was a regular commuter for a long time. One of the things that threw me is I kind of thought I knew the layout, and when I got to the new one, I wound up exiting at the Moynihan.
Right.
And I had no clue where I was. But you're right. It's bright. It's clean. It's going to be a big surprise to anybody that hasn't seen it in a while.
Yeah, it really is disorienting, right? Because, you're so used to coming off your train and there are these markers that kind of tell you where you are, whether it's the McDonald's or the Rose's Pizza or what have you. And it's completely different now. So, you emerge from your track and you get to the main level there, and it takes a moment to figure out where you are. But if you're exiting through Moynihan, there are worse things to do because Moynihan's beautiful also.
Yeah, it's weird. You could keep your head down and just keep walking because we were like lemmings. We all just knew where we were going, but now you do have to keep your head up. And One of the things I thought, and it's probably just me, but maybe a little more signage to,
Yes.
street.
I know. And it's fascinating because at the same time we're talking about Penn Station, we also have Grand Central Madison. I mean, the two main terminals in Manhattan for the Long Island Railroad are both essentially new now. I mean, Penn Station, you step outside a certain area and it still looks a lot like the old Penn Station, but at least the main part that the Long Island Railroad uses does look very new. But this has been a big complaint on Grand Central Madison for sure. And that's even more disorienting, obviously, because this is a space that wasn't even there. And the other kind of complication is that it is essentially a terminal within a terminal, because Grand Central Madison sits below Grand Central Terminal. So if you're coming from the street or exiting to the street, it could be a pretty, complicated labyrinth kind of a situation down there. And I've heard a lot from people who still haven't figured out exactly where they are. It's going to take some time.
Yeah, definitely. Is there anything else planned around Penn Station that's?
Oh, sure. Yeah. I mean, that's the really interesting thing is as major a project as this has been, and it's been underway for something like 4 years. It was in two phases. The first phase, the real culmination, was the opening of what they call the East End Gateway, which is that new entrance exit from Penn Station that goes out to 33rd Street. The big escalators that look right out to the Empire State Building. They opened that at the end of 2020, and then the rest of the work really has been widening this that corridor there, widening the walkway and raising the ceiling. But relative to what the plans are for Penn Station in the future, this is relatively small work. The bigger plan is still an $8 billion, and that's a rough estimate. They've said 7. They've said as much as 8. This is the governor saying it. A total reconstruction of Penn Station. And what that's going to look like is still very much up in the air. There are a lot of competing visions. Pat Foy, who is a former chairman of the MTA, he's a Long Island guy, a former Nassau County deputy executive. He heads a company here in North America that is a bigger international conglomerate from Italy that has its plan. It's kind of again an alternate vision for what Penn Station could be, which would entail kind of building a pedestal around Madison Square Garden that would be enclosed in glass. And a lot of these competing visions are about how do you get, for the last, whatever it's been, 60 years, Penn Station has been the basement of Madison Square Garden. And that's why it's been so cramped and dingy. Yeah. And the work they just are finishing now does allow some natural light in there for the first time, and at least a piece of Penn Station. And they've done a good job with the LED lighting to make the place a little brighter. But that seems to be one of the key goals, is how do we get some real light down there? And it's difficult when Madison Square Garden is there. So it's about where can we squeeze in an atrium, some light. There are proposals to knock down most of the upper level of Penn Station where Amtrak operates right now, create skylights. And again, what that's going to look like is very much up in the air. The other thing that, again, is kind of uncertain right now was this bigger plan for the Penn Station district, where there would be several sky rises, a lot of office towers built around Penn Station. The money that we generated from those would help fund improvements in Penn Station. Now, with the uncertainty of the office market after COVID, it's not entirely clear where that project is and how it's going to go forward. There is a proposal to knock down the block right next to Penn Station, so you can actually build new tracks and an actual expansion of the tracks down there. That's still very uncertain because there's a lot of environmental reviews that have to go into that. Mm-hmm. And then another thing that a lot of people are talking about now is the future of Madison Square Garden. It's been where it is for whatever it is, like 60 years now. Right. And it's not quite a lease. I mean, I think that's sort of the shorthand, but they've got a special operating permit with the city of New York that allows them to hold big events there with more than 2,500 people. That's up this summer. And they'll need some kind of extension from the city to continue operating there. And some are looking at this as an opportunity to move Madison Square Garden, and in doing so, you could really expand Penn Station and really build it out. So lots of ideas there.
Yeah. Well, just a reminder, you're listening to this week's Long Island News on the Voice of Nassau Community College, 90.3 WHPC. My name is Bill McIntyre, and my guest today is Alfonso Castillo, transit reporter for Newsday and Newsday.com. I was thinking about, as I watched TV and saw all the consternation that the Long Island Railroad riders, they showed at the different stations, and it just occurred to me that it must have been an actuarial that sat down with a pencil and figured out that this is what the future is going to look like. Even the amount of people they thought were going to go to Grand Central, or that they were chomping at the bit for this thing to happen. Because I think they initially estimated almost 50% of the people would want to go there, and that turned out to not be the case. But it just seemed that those days when they changed the schedule from one day to the next. And then they sent not so many trains, or sometimes too many trains with not enough cars. It really looked like a mess. I don't know. What were they thinking? Yeah,
I mean, they've certainly received a lot of criticism for the rollout of that plan. I think there's been an acknowledgement by the LIRR that the new service to Grand Central Madison got off to a very bumpy start. That's a question I've heard a lot from riders. Where were they getting the data that informed the decisions about service levels? And they've acknowledged that in large part, it was based on some surveys that are almost 10 years old now, go back to 2014. They say that they gave some of that data a refresher back in 2021 after COVID, and that they largely got the same information about where people wanted to go. Now, they make the point that their information wasn't necessarily that far off. I think those early projections were something like 55-45. They sort of rounded it to 60-40, and it ended up being 70-30 at the outset. But as I understand it, there were some days where Grand Central has gotten around that 40% mark. So I think some people are still kind of figuring this out. There are probably, I don't know what that number is, but there's probably some amount of people that could and maybe should be commuting to Grand Central Madison that just haven't kind of figured that out yet. Right. Commuters are creatures of habit. And I've heard from folks who are headed to maybe that kind of that Times Square area if they're going to see a show or something like that, and are upset that their train to Penn Station maybe isn't on the schedule anymore, when going to Grand Central Madison basically gets them the same distance to where they're going. So some of it is just sort of rethinking what your commute is. But I mean, I think it's fair to say, in as much as it was just 30% a lot of days of Manhattan commuters going to Grand Central Madison, and the other 70% were still going to Penn Station. The rollout of that service, the majority of Long Island Railroad commuters were not pleased because their commutes changed, and not necessarily for the better. Those first several weeks, I've said it, I've never, and this is a population that is often rightfully upset with their commute, and I never saw them this upset. I mean, they were really, it was a level of frustration and outrage that I haven't seen covering this beat for 15 years. It's eased somewhat, and the Long Island Railroad has made a lot of adjustments over the last several weeks as they've monitored what these trends are. But certainly there are people who are still very much not happy, want their old commute back, or dealing with crowds, or, I've heard from folks who, just because the way the times of trains lined up, are getting home now an hour later, or have to leave home to get to work an hour earlier. There are more changes on the way. Around Memorial Day, the Long Island Railroad usually releases its next schedule for the summer. They've said that riders, they've made these little tweaks over the last a month or so they intend to make some bigger changes with that next schedule, and they're gathering input from riders. The Long Island Railroad Commuter Council has put out its own survey, trying to get information from riders. So the hope is that this next schedule will take into account a lot of issues that maybe weren't taken into account when the schedule was rolled out.
Right. I commuted for 10 years into the city, and I rarely had a problem with the railroad. As far as I thought it was pretty efficient. I knew I could get on a 5:16 train in Penn Station. I'd be home by 6:16. And it was fairly regular. Then I also lived through the train strike. We used to have to drive into Queens and catch a subway to wherever we wanted to go. And that was a zoo. There was only one time during a snowstorm that the train stopped in between stations, and we had to climb off the train down.
Oh God, I've seen pictures of that over the years. Yeah.
But in all, in that 10 years, one time, and I thought, well, things are going to happen. The other thing with the Madison Square Garden is that's a very kind of a symbiotic relationship that they had. Seeing as how people could take the train in to go to an event. Wasn't Madison Square Garden originally like down on 48th Street?
Certainly it was somewhere different than it is now. I think my dad's told me about the original Madison Square Garden, but it predates me. I think they moved into this space mid-late 60s, I believe. Yeah. But it's a good point, and it is one of I think the more confounding changes that I've heard from Long Island Railroad riders is, as you touched on, introducing this new service at Grand Central Madison meant to some extent reducing service to Madison Square Garden, and it's kind of an alternating schedule where one train leaves from here, one train leaves from there. So it's sort of like they split the schedule, not entirely, but some of that. And during the rush hour, again, I think there's been a fair amount of demand on Grand Central Madison. Outside the rush hour, I think it drops off quite a bit. And what some people are really puzzled by is, those trains that were so important to get people to and from Madison Square Garden events, whether it's a Rangers game or a Bruce Springsteen concert or something like that. Some folks are coming out of these events now, heading down to Penn Station, and the next train isn't for, a long time, a long wait. And meanwhile, there are trains departing out of Grand Central Madison around the same time, basically empty. So people are questioning whether that makes any sense. And this is something that they've got to figure out. The railroad makes the point. Even now, they're 2 months into this service plan. Something that Penn Station was there for 110 years by itself. Now a whole second terminal. I think they'd make the point. It's going to take some time to work out these kinks.
Yeah, I think re-educating the populace is kind of like changing the course of a river.
Right?
It's not going to happen in a day. And like you said, people have to rethink their commute.
And the other thing, and again, rightfully so, a lot of what you're hearing is the negativity, the complaints, and the reality is the majority of commuters are not going to Grand Central Madison. So a lot of these changes have been unwelcome by a lot of commuters. But there are also, it's one of the interesting things about these last few months on this beat is that it has been both the worst time ever commuting for some folks, and it's the absolute glory days for others. I mean, if you hear from people who work near the east side, who for 20, 30 years have been trekking from Penn Station, either on foot or doing the subway ride, taking 2 trains to get over to Grand Central Madison, this is a revelation. This is saving them an hour a day, getting them home earlier. And there's Grand Central Madison that I think most people agree is very beautiful and just a more pleasant experience to commute through than what they had been used to for a long time. So there's certainly absolutely people, many of them, who have benefited quite a bit from these changes.
Right.
Then there's a third group that we haven't talked a lot about. but certainly key players here, and those are the Brooklyn commuters. And they're some of the angriest because their commute really got, I think, changed more than any others in as much as there are relatively few direct trains from Long Island to Brooklyn anymore. They've been mostly replaced with the shuttle service from Jamaica. LIRR makes the point that means there's actually more trains going back and forth from Brooklyn than ever before, but it's just a different system. You get off your train at Jamaica, and before your connection was right across the tracks and was waiting for you. Now there's this mad dash up to the walkway and all the way across to this dedicated track. It's just it's a different vibe, and Brooklyn commuters really feel like they've kind of gotten shortchanged here. A lot of attention paid to Grand Central commuters, and now even Penn Station commuters have all these improvements. And Brooklyn commuters feel like they kind of been left out in the cold, and there are many of them, they feel neglected.
Yeah. Well, I don't think they wanted to be so physically involved in their commute.
Yeah,
that exercise routine every day, getting off the train.
Yeah, and if you're a person with disability, mobility issues,
that's a whole nother.
If you got a stroller or something like that, and I see these folks when I'm there, and it's a real challenge.
Yeah. Again, a reminder: if you're listening to this week's Long Island News on the Voice of Nassau Community College, 90.3 WHPC. My name is Bill McIntyre, and my guest today is Alfonso Castillo, transit reporter for Newsday at Newsday.com. Well, now, there was a plan to build an AirTrain to LaGuardia. Did they put the kibosh on that now, or?
Yes. The governor, it's probably about a month ago now, announced that it is officially off the table. This was a plan that was really pushed by her predecessor, Andrew Cuomo, when she came into office. I think she signaled right away that she had some strong reservations about this project, and there was a panel put together of experts along with the Port Authority to look at the various options, and they put out a report again about a month ago that really spelled out why this was not a great option. And the governor said she was following the recommendations and officially nixed the project. There were a lot of issues, not the least of which was cost. I think it's something that, it grew tremendously. I think the original projections were something like $400 million, and it grew to $2 billion. So an expensive project. And one of the key complaints was that it was a pretty indirect route. So in as much as so much of the goal was to facilitate travelers getting to Manhattan, if you're visiting New York, it's likely where you're headed. This would have been pretty indirect, because the link would have been to the Metz Willets Point City Field stop on the Long Island Railroad's Port Washington line. Okay. So you'd be going east. The other challenge there is that is the one Long Island Railroad branch that does not connect with Jamaica. So what you'd be having to do is go from LaGuardia east to Metz Willets Point to double back west to Woodside to catch a train if you were going to Manhattan. Now, if you're going anywhere east other than somewhere in the Port Washington line, it would have been going LaGuardia east to City Field, west to Woodside, back east to Jamaica. So this kind of zigzag pattern. Again, that was a big obstacle to overcome. They also faced a lot of opposition from conservationists who were really concerned about what the construction would do, and just a big uphill battle to climb, and didn't make it. So now the plan is to enhance and improve bus service to and from LaGuardia. And there's a real question about, how appealing that is especially to Long Islanders, who in the city, there's more of a bus culture, out here, a lot much. Less so. Yeah.
Well, out here, I think, people should try it. They should really see exactly what it takes to move around Long Island using only buses. things that take you 10 minutes takes 2.5 hours to get.
Absolutely.
And a lot of it is standing on a corner waiting for that bus to come.
In the rain, in the snow. Yeah. I mean, covering the speed, it's one thing that you learned is nobody takes the bus because they want to out here. Yeah. And that's a little bit different again from the city. I mean, if you're in the city and if I'm spending an afternoon in Manhattan with the family and we're going to museums or whatever, it's not unusual at all for us to jump on a bus and you go across town. And you just don't see that out here. Now, that said, I do think that the plan for the bus service for LaGuardia, it might not be what people know as bus service here. For one, it's free. It's going to be a lot more direct. There's already this bus service there that I think it's out of Woodside, and people I've heard who have used it have said it's pretty convenient. And not bad at all, and a fairly direct link to the Long Island Railroad. I think it's like 15 minutes from Woodside, right to LaGuardia. So they're hoping to win over some travelers.
Yeah. I think we never should have gotten rid of trolleys in New York City. I think they would be really cool to have these days.
Yeah, I was in Northport not long ago, and you still see the
tracks,
the tracks right along the street.
Yeah, right. Well, we got about half a minute. Anything you want to tell us about what's, going on in the...
There's always a lot of stories cooking. I've got something that should be coming on the next couple of days, updating a story that I know was very important to commuters early in the pandemic. And these were folks who had money in these transit accounts that are automatically deducted from your paycheck to go cover your railroad costs. And when they stopped commuting near the beginning of the pandemic, and a lot of folks never returned to commuting. That money's been sitting there now for 3 years. They haven't been able to get it out. There have been various proposals that would require changing, federal tax law to get them out. And I'm working on an update on that situation. A lot more. I plan to write more about what's going on at Penn Station and the future of the plans there, and follow up with how Grand Central Madison's doing. So
I always thumb through the paper looking for the stuff you wrote too.
Yep, I was doing a lot of video these days. We just launched Newsday TV about a month ago now, and it's kind of the new frontier for Newsday. So for folks who aren't big newspaper readers, you could download it on your phone. You could stream it on your streaming device, Roku or what have you.
You look good on TV.
Thank you very much.
Well, my guest today has been Alfonso Castillo, transit reporter for Newsday and Newsday.com. Again, thanks for taking the time to be here to speak with us, and hopefully we'll get together again soon to stay abreast of these things.
Absolutely. Always a pleasure.
The clock on the wall says it's time for this week's Long Island News to get on out of here. I'm Bill McIntyre. Remember, you can listen to us by searching for this week's Long Island News wherever you listen to podcasts, and we're right here every Friday at 3 p.m. on the radio, on the voice of Nassau Community College, 90.3 WHPC.